Today we're going to look at McCarthyism in the sense of it being a witch hunt, and we will tie it a little bit into the introduction for The Crucible by Arthur Miller. So what is McCarthyism? Well, we do have this ideal of the Red Scare. People were wondering if America under communism in the 1950s would lead us into coming into communism. Basically, we call it the witch hunt without witches. So, McCarthyism is a term for the widespread accusations and investigations of suspected communist activities in the U.S. during the 1950s. Now, why it sticks out so much in our minds for political dominance is that there was insufficient evidence. There was a lot of accusations from the government against people of a wide variety of mistakes and just outright accusations. And it was completely unfair because there is insufficient evidence. They were held and put on trial without any evidence whatsoever. But what were they doing? Well, they were doing it to suppress opposition. If you seemed in the arts, if you seemed in Hollywood, or even in politics, to oppose the people who were in power at the time, they could easily, under the idea of communist activities, arrest you and hold you without sufficient evidence for quite some time. Well, this was fed by the quick invention of the Soviet atomic bomb. Before the 1950s, only the United States had this particular bomb. Once the Soviet Union has it, and all of a sudden we get into what we know as the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, people are pretty scared. And then it was assumed that Russian spies must have obviously helped the Soviet Union create the atomic bomb. Therefore, there must be Americans who are helping the Soviets within the government. Now, they blamed the problems of the U.S. on the supposed secret presence of communists in the government. It couldn't be Americans versus Americans. It had to be secret communists that were against the Americans. Where do we get the name of McCarthyism? Well, we get it after Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. At the time, he was a little-known junior senator from Wisconsin. And then, all of a sudden, he claims to possess a list of 205 card-carrying communists employed in the U.S. Department of State. Once he held up a list, which was actually never a list of names, in front of a camera, he became a sensation overnight. All of a sudden, McCarthyism comes into vogue. Well, how does it all start? Well, he starts by saying that there are several communists in the state of California and in the state of New York. All of them are card-carrying citizens of communism, and yet they're also citizens of the United States. Now, communism was not illegal. It was not illegal to be a card-carrying communist in the United States in the 1950s. But McCarthy wanted to expose them to decrease their credibility. They were scared of bombings from Russia, and therefore people got kind of scared of the word of communism. And because they now had a senator that was saying that this was where we supposedly had our supplies from, that these people were obviously working with the Russians in order to help create the bombs, we were going to see a lot of people believe this incredulous behavior that McCarthy had. And then, of course, you've been looking at the pictures. We also have political cartoons that are showing a lot of the Red Scare. So how did they get into actually decreasing credibility and even arresting Americans? Well, we had what's known as loyalty boards. Now, loyalty boards investigated the federal workers under Truman's command to search to see if they had any ties to communism. And then Senator Joseph R. McCarthy created the Un-American Activities Committee, otherwise known as the HUAC or the HUAC. Now, the HUAC was most widely known for its investigations of suspected communist influence in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. And in 1947, the HUAC subpoenaed 41 witnesses for its hearings on communist influence in Hollywood. Again, remember, Hollywood is creating TV shows, it's creating movies. They are influencing not only American citizens, but practically everyone across the world is watching Hollywood movies and listening to the lines that are being produced by several of these writers from the most famous actors in the world. So then we get to what's known as the Hollywood 10 and their blacklisting. Now, 10 of them, mostly writers and directors, refused to answer questions at first. They denounced the committee and they were held in contempt of Congress. Now, these witnesses became known as the Hollywood 10, and they were blacklisted from their industry in Hollywood for many years afterwards. Because they were being held in contempt of Congress, nobody wanted to work with these 10 from Hollywood afterwards, so they essentially lost their careers. Why did it work? Well, 8 of the 10 actors refused to appear in court and were sentenced to a year in prison. And of course, once you get blacklisted, informally, if you were accused of communism, nobody was going to hire you. So then deals started being made. If you start selling out your friends, you might keep your reputation. McCarthyism is now used as a reference to reckless public accusations of disloyalty to the U.S. But with the Red Scare, as they started going through Hollywood and people started seeing that, like the Hollywood 10, you would go to prison, you would never work in Hollywood again. All of a sudden, people who were scared of losing their jobs, scared of losing their careers, they started thinking if they started cutting deals, maybe perhaps they could sell out their friends and get better deals in Hollywood, maybe move up the lines a bit faster in order to keep their reputation, in order to keep working in Hollywood. Well, what are the effects of McCarthyism? Well, first of all, innocent people's careers were ruined. 320 artists were blacklisted, among them Arthur Miller and Charlie Chaplin. They do continue working afterwards, but it took several years for them to get back into work in Hollywood again. And even after that, there were certain companies, there were certain production companies that just would not work with actors who had been blacklisted. Now, Arthur Miller, at the time, because he's going through this particular stage, he writes what's known as the Crucible as an allegory for the unjust accusations of Joseph McCarthy. Again, when we talk about an allegory is a larger symbol. They use lots of symbolism in order to try and tell a story that they can't outright tell. So Arthur Miller cannot outright speak of McCarthyism and how wrong it is to go after people who either are not communists at all, or even, and communism wasn't illegal, even if they were a communist, you wouldn't be able to be arrested for that. We look at the allegory of the Crucible in order to kind of talk about the unjust accusations of Senator McCarthy. So let's look at Arthur Miller, one of the blacklisted authors. He grew up during the Great Depression. He wrote screenplays for Hollywood, and he won a Pulitzer Prize in 1949 for Death of a Salesman. So at the time that the Red Scare, at the time McCarthyism comes into play, Arthur Miller is absolutely everything going for him. He is a famous playwright in Hollywood, and he's a famous playwright on Broadway. He won the Pulitzer in 1949. And then shortly after that, only a year or two later, he gets blacklisted. So in 1953, he writes The Crucible, and it's based on the Salem witch trials. But he also wrote the play during the McCarthy hearings when his friends were being attacked for pro-communist activities. So yes, even though The Crucible is based on the 1692 Salem witch trials of the United States, he does write before and afterwards about how a lot of the Crucible is influenced as an allegory about the McCarthy hearings and about his friends being attacked for pro-communist activities. And so here's some pictures of Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller at the time on the left-hand side, that was what he looked like in the 1950s, and what he looked like today, basically in the 2000s. So when The Crucible opened in January of 1953, the audiences noted the similarities between the Salem witch trials and the HUAC investigations. Hence the idea of allegory. He doesn't have to come out and say specifically what he's trying to say, but if he uses enough symbolisms, the reader is going to get the projected symbolism. Now, in 1956, Arthur Miller was called to testify before the committee. He was later convicted of contempt of Congress because he refused to name persons seen at meetings organized by so-called communist sympathizers. Miller's conviction was overturned in 1958. Nevertheless, he was blacklisted between those 2 years. Thanks so much for stopping by, guys. If you like what you see, please leave a like. If you want to comment on something else that I can record, let me know. If you like the channel, please subscribe. Otherwise, go check out my other videos. Thanks for stopping by.